Hello, everyone. This is Cozy Night Frights. Before you go to sleep, please like the video and subscribe and tell me where you watch from and what time you are listening. I've never told anyone this story before since I was scared they'd think I'm insane. I was a 13-year-old girl with rather bad eyesight. I was never an outdoor person. I liked staying inside my room and I hated leaving it since I always felt unsafe and anxious around everyone, family and strangers alike. So my parents decided to send me and my younger sister, who was 2 years, behind me on a one-week camping trip during the wonderful month of August. Saying that I wasn't very happy about it would be an understatement. We arrived at the campground where I met my camp leaders. There were 3 in total, ages ranging from 19 to 22. I was put into a tent with a few other girls. We set up our sleeping bags for the night, yet none of us slept. The others were just chatting the entire night while I listened. When morning came, we were all very tired. I could tell they weren't used to staying up all night. Personally, I had a very broken sleep schedule. I would sleep for about 4 hours a week, so I was fine. Or rather, I was used to it. That day we did some camp activities like learning how to start a fire and how to identify plants. I even saw a couple of deer. I'll skip ahead a few days since nothing happened for the next 3 days. On the second to last night to spend at the camp, I really wanted to go back home. Again, I couldn't sleep, so I was just using a very subtle nightlight to read. It barely illuminated the pages since I was careful not to wake up the leaders and the girls in my tent. It was then I noticed how eerily quiet it was. Other than my slow breathing and the pages I was turning, I brushed off this unease, this silence, and decided to enjoy it. After all, I think silence is underrated. Suddenly, the girl next to me woke up and groggily told me she wanted to use the bathroom. But she was too scared to go alone. I mean, who wouldn't be? The nearest bathroom was at least 2 miles away, and walking those 2 miles in the woods and then back uphill would be tiring, to say the least. I gave her a comforting smile, telling her I'd go with her even though I wanted to stay in the tent and the warmth of my sleeping bag and the peacefulness of the light yellow glow of my nightlight. I twisted my ankle a day prior, and it hurt. But I didn't bring it up. I endured it. I got out of the tent with the slightly taller girl and I turned on my flashlight. We walked slowly about 100 feet into the woods so we wouldn't disturb anyone. She quickly went behind a tree and did her business while I used my flashlight to observe the darkness of the woods. An immense amount of dread hit me like a bus, and I thought I was having another panic attack. My anxiety became worse when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. On reflex, I pointed my flashlight in that direction. "Amelia," a familiar voice called out. My sister's voice. Wait. My sister's voice? She was 8 miles away on the other side of the campground in a cabin. I was confused. My sister could never walk that far in the dark, no less. She was scared of the dark, and her stamina was low. I turned to where the voice came from and pointed my flashlight in that direction. Just out of the light's glow stood a girl just an inch shorter than me with short brown hair and a naturally skinny figure. The more I inspected her, the more I noticed she was skinnier than usual, actually. My sister is already very petite. You can see her bones through her skin. But that girl I saw in the forest who resembled my sister, I could see each and every bone in her body exactly, where it was, and her joints appeared broken. That was when my campmate finished her business. She came back and reached for my arm. When she made contact with me, I flinched. "It's just me," she said. Her voice held concern and emotion. But it was just her. "Amelia," my sister called out again. It seemed as if her voice was a recording getting played repeatedly. I kept looking at the figure until the girl behind me asked, barely above a whisper, "Who is that?" In a questioning tone, I answered, "It looks like my sister, but it can't be her. I spoke in a quiet whisper. The girl barely heard me. We should go, I said sternly this time, but I tried to keep my voice barely above a whisper. So, the two of us did what any logical people would do. We ran. My ankle hurt so much, but I never stopped, and I could hear that thing that looked like my sister trying to catch up to us. It was fast, but we were faster. We got to the campgrounds and we immediately got inside the tent. Only then did I realize how bad my ankle actually hurt. "Oh, what's that smell?" the girl to my left said. It smelled of rot and iron, a smell I was familiar with due to living on a farm for 8 years of my life. I quickly replied, "Somebody probably took a dump near the campsite." I lied, knowing they'd believe me. "Probably just one of the boys," the girl replied with a tired eye roll. I smiled at her and told her she should get some rest. Everyone who had awakened went back to sleep. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring out the small opening of the window of our tent. It was still there, yet it no longer looked like my sister. Instead, it looked like my mother. A creepy smile stretched across its face. I made eye contact with it. My mother's green eyes had been replaced with a milky white. I looked away after noticing that. I kept thinking, I need to make it through this night. Just tonight and tomorrow night, and I can go back home. I was doing my best not to have a panic attack. Finally, morning came and we went through our usual day. But of course, night returned. That night I tried my best to fall asleep, which I actually did. The following morning we packed our things and said our goodbyes. I got in my parents' car with my sister when they showed up. My mother and father greeted us with smiles, asking about our trip. "It was decent," I replied in my usual quiet, monotone voice. "I thought it was fun." My little sister smiled, with joy lacing her tone. It was her. It wasn't that creature, that mimic. I was relieved to know this was my real sister. We got home and I immediately took a shower. After unpacking, I went skateboarding, which I do to get my mind off of things. That day, I made a conclusion. I would never go camping again. My experience in the rural Oregon mountains from Wicked Wendigo, when I would hear the old adage, right place at the right time. I'd think to myself, yeah, okay, it's all just coincidence. But after what I've been through these past 6 weeks, my mind is changing. Maybe you're put in a specific place at a specific time for a reason. As most of you know, the PNW Pacific Northwest, for those unfamiliar, was recently ravaged by an ungodly amount of wildfires at the time of writing this. I mean, seeing the little fire emojis dotted all over maps of California, Oregon, and Washington made my heart ache. My home was burning. Fortunately for myself and my family, our area hadn't been hit as hard as many others. I'd planned a camping trip a few weeks prior to this pandemic of wildfires, so I was happy to see that my usual spot wasn't near any major fires and subsequently had been deemed safe to travel and to camp in. I'm a camping enthusiast, and I enjoy deep wilderness. Camping, my usual spot, is fairly remote. It requires a 2-hour drive up a 2-lane road into the middle of nowhere, followed by a 30-minute drive up an old logging road that ultimately crests a small mountain. The mountain's slope leads into a beautiful valley with much larger mountains encircling the valley from the north, and east in the center was a decently sized clearing. The clearing was littered with fallen logs, beautiful pink and yellow yarrow flowers, and the occasional family of white-tailed deer. This was my true happy place. This valley has a name, but I'll keep it hidden. For anonymity purposes, I left on a Tuesday morning in early September. The drive to the mountain was relatively uneventful besides almost hitting a large buck who decided to cross the road right in front of my truck. I arrived on the mountain crest on schedule and began unpacking the bed. Of my truck, I had just recently bought a new 2020 Toyota Tacoma. I parked my truck facing the clearing roughly 5 feet from the edge of a small drop-off. The slope down to the valley wasn't steep, and it's fairly easy to hike down. I'd say it's about 400 to 450 feet from where I parked down to the start of the valley floor. I had my camp set up, just as dusk was setting. I'd usually have a large fire going, but with the previously mentioned wildfires that wasn't possible. I brought a small propane stove and space heater to prevent any accidents. As I finished gulping down my last bite of dinner, I noticed it was quickly growing dark. I hopped off my tailgate and made my way to my driver's side door as I was digging in my pockets for my keys. I looked down into the valley and I noticed something strange. I could make out 2 small circular lights in the far distance. They flickered as they quickly moved closer to the clearing. It looked as if they were hovering and navigating through the trees at a steady pace. I crouched in front of my truck and I looked on in curiosity. I watched for a few minutes until the lights eventually arrived at the tree line of the clearing. I could hear the humming of motorcycle engines echoing from the valley. That's when I realized what I was staring at. What on earth were these 2 people doing? Riding dirt bikes out here. This was the first time I'd ever seen another person out here. The lights were stationary at this point. I assumed the 2 riders were off their bikes and walking around the clearing. Although this is only speculation, as I couldn't see anything. Aside from the 2 bike headlights, I knew they couldn't see me as I had no visible lights on, or a campfire. Instantly, I thought to grab my phone out of my glove box. Local news stations warned the public of suspicious people intentionally starting fires in the woods. They encouraged citizens to be vigilant and gather any evidence they could in an absolute lapse in judgment. I pressed the unlock button on my keys. My truck lights flashed and a loud beeping sound rang out. I'd just given a beacon to my location to these midnight riders. In a rush of adrenaline, I threw myself on the ground. Stomach. First, my mind was screaming, "Good," going Einstein. I could barely think as my heart was pounding in my ears. I watched as the bike lights began to turn back into the direction they came from, and eventually they disappeared into the dark. I could hear the engines revving harder than they had before. That unsettled me a bit as I stood up and brushed myself off. I began thinking about how odd it was. Usually people with good intentions do not run off like that when they notice other campers. These people were obviously up to no good down there. Maybe they were drug traffickers, meth cookers, arsonists. My mind was filled with awe. The potential threats I might have alerted to my location. I sat in my truck mulling over my options. Should I drive home? What if they're waiting for me at the end of the logging road, or was I just overreacting? I decided to pack up camp and spend the night in my truck and drive home first thing in the morning. After packing everything up, I drove down the logging road a little ways and backed into a small gap in the mountain phase. That way, if the midnight riders decided to pay me a visit, they might just miss me. I was in full paranoia mode. I lowered my seat back, racked around into my handgun, and eventually dozed off as the adrenaline turned into exhaustion. I awoke to my alarm with my Life for Hire by Adter blaring from my phone. In a groggy daze, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. My phone said it was morning. Looking out my windshield, I could see thick brown smoke swirling in the wind as I stepped out of my truck. I was hit with the intense smell of burning wood, as you've probably guessed. Now there was a fire very close by. I jumped back into my truck and raced back up the mountain from my camping spot. I'd be able to get a better understanding of the situation as I drove way too fast up this narrow logging road. I noticed the smoke was thinning out as my elevation grew. My heart sank at the realization when I reached the crest. I jumped into the truck bed and looked out over the valley. I could see blue skies above the mountains across from me to the north and east. My heart sank at this as it confirmed my suspicion. I turned towards the logging road to my right. I could see the smoke thicken from that direction. I was trapped. My mind instantly went to the 2 riders from the previous night. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. Of course, no such luck. I jumped off my truck bed and threw my passenger door open. I frantically searched for my backpack once I found it. I ripped it apart looking for my GPS satellite phone. I kissed it with joy when I grabbed it. From the bottom of the bag, I flipped it open and thanked the Lord. I had a signal. I called 911 to report the fire and request help. I chatted with the operator for about 15 minutes. The operator said she'd contact local wildland firefighting companies and attempt to get a helicopter to evacuate me. After being on hold for a few minutes, I was transferred to a helicopter pilot who worked for a wildland firefighting company that was nearby. I mentioned the valley by name, and the man said he knew where it was. He claimed they were sending a helicopter to pick me up, and that I needed to be there and ready to leave as soon as they landed. After we disconnected, I rushed to clear out my truck of any valuables. I sadly rubbed the dashboard and said sorry to my new truck, as it was evident the fire would eventually consume her. I then gradually started making my way down the slope and into the valley. After only falling a few times, I reached the valley floor. I then bolted through the trees and towards the clearing. My lungs were on fire as I neared the clearing. As I broke through the tree line, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. After a few minutes of lying there, catching my breath, I got back onto my feet. I started walking towards the center of the clearing. When I made it to what I assumed was the center, I glanced up at the peak of the small mountain. I could see my bright red truck sitting where I left it. Roughly 200 feet to the left of it was a wall of fire black. Smoke rose from the wall as it raced up the mountain. I turned away, not wanting to watch $39,000 literally going up in flames. I began scanning the skies, searching for my rescue. I concentrated on listening for the chopping sound of a helicopter's rotors. As I stood there listening, I heard something else that made me question my sanity just to my left. I could hear someone crying out. A shockwave ran through me. I stood there, unable to believe my ears. I unholstered my handgun and called back, "Hello, is someone there?" I then began to hear muffled screaming. I ran toward the screaming, trying to hold back tears. I noticed a piece of plywood, roughly 4 by 8 feet, covered in branches and dirt. It lay on the ground with a large boulder set on top of it. I called again. "Hello." I heard the muffled scream again. This time it was much louder and unmistakable. Is there really someone under that plywood? I thought to myself. I rushed over to attempt to move the boulder. After struggling a few times, I managed to push the boulder off the plywood. Slowly, I lifted up the plywood and threw it to the side. What I saw is something I'll never forget. Sitting inside the small hole, which was no bigger than 4 by 4 feet, was a woman. Her wrists were zip-tied and her mouth was gagged with a piece of cloth. I gasped and took a step back. I couldn't believe it. What in the world was going on? Woman was frantically looking around. I snapped out of my shock and rushed to help her. She flinched as I reached out to grab her. I lifted her out of the hole and I removed the cloth from her mouth. She began to yell in Spanish and she raised her arms. I told her, "Calm down. You're safe now." I cut the zip ties that were binding her wrists. She instantly started pointing behind me and repeating. I didn't understand her, as unfortunately I didn't know Spanish. I turned around quickly where she was pointing. I noticed 4 more pieces of plywood scattered across the clearing. I was horrified. I rushed over and began to flip them over one by one, but one by one they were empty. The woman, following me as I did this, let out a pained cry as I flipped the last piece of plywood, exposing a 4th and final empty hole. She collapsed on the ground and began to sob. I tried to ask what was wrong, but I couldn't understand her. As I tried to console her, I heard the distinct sound of helicopter rotors. I looked up to see the chopper descending into the valley. I helped the woman up and I put her arm over my shoulder as we rushed to the awaiting chopper. A man jumped out from the side doors. When we made it to him, he helped the woman in, then stopped and yelled, "You didn't tell us there'd be 2 of you." I yelled back, trying to be heard over the loud rotors. "I just found her. I have no idea what's happening." He then replied, "You found her? What are you?" "Never mind. We don't have time. Get in." He helped me into the helicopter and shut the doors. Soon after we started to ascend, I looked down over the valley to see the fire had engulfed the peak and was halfway down the slope towards the valley. I sat back in relief. I was finally safe. But I had so many questions, the state police and EMTs met us when we landed back at base camp. I explained the entire situation, and they took the woman and I back to the station. Eventually, I was released after telling my story to 6 different officers. My wife picked me up and I was able to return home. That wasn't the end. Unfortunately, over these last 6 weeks, I was interviewed by local authorities, state authorities, S. Marshals, ICE, even a pair of FBI agents. My final interview was with the 2 FBI agents. They were the only ones who gave me any real information on the situation after retelling my story. Just as I did here, they filled in some holes for me. They explained that I likely stumbled upon a human trafficking operation when I unlocked my truck. It spooked the traffickers. He said I was lucky I hid in that gap when I did, as they more than likely went up the logging road to handle me when they couldn't locate me. They probably assumed I'd left to get the police, so they packed up any valuable assets, including the woman's younger daughter, and started the fire to destroy any evidence before I could alert the authorities. I asked about the girl. I found the older agent informed me that she and her daughter had been kidnapped from Nicaragua. The woman claimed they were set to be sold to someone in Russia, but now she was being held in government custody until she could be returned home. He then said, "She's lucky you came along. When you did, you were at the right place at the right time." I've always called it a dryad from Shade Collins. It may not be a long story or a great story, but it happened. I've worked in construction most of my life, so I'm not much of a storyteller type. So bear with me. It was around 26 years ago. My parents had just bought me a pup tent for my monthly Boy Scout campouts because I was 14, and several of the high school kids had left me covered in bruises during the previous campouts over the last year. This pup tent was about 6 feet long and 3-ish feet high. It was a dark green A-frame style tint, with an entrance at one side with a zippered mosquito net cover, one down the middle and one from each side. There was also a rain cover outside of the tent that could be tied with 2 binding sets of straps. Whenever we'd go camping, the first thing we would do was clear the area of debris. In this case, it was sticks and long grass. We had to use lawnmowers from the Scoutmaster's trailer to cut it down. So after my first day out, I set up my little tent outside and away, maybe 15 to 20 feet from the big 8-person tents that all the other kids were sleeping in. I crawled in as there was barely room to sit upright inside of it and just enough room to turn around in the tent without hitting the sides. I got into my blue summer sleeping bag, zipped it up, made sure my camping pack was by my feet, and I went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. Someone was messing with the zipper. I was basically alone. So hearing the brand new zipper come up was enough to wake me. I grabbed my flashlight, a mini mag light, with my right hand, and I set up and flashed it at my feet, which were by the entrance, and what I saw made no sense. At the time, there was a girl with her head in my tent up to her shoulders with her hands in my backpack. She didn't seem to be wearing a top of any kind. The only reason I call this a girl is because it had cleavage, but my size 12 feet were in the way, so I didn't see her chest. Its skin was a pale green, and its hair was a deeper forest green, tied back into what I could best describe as dreadlocks. It took me a minute to notice, but there seemed to be leaves in the thing's hair. They seemed to be ivy leaves. Her face could be traditionally described as beautiful. God features high cheekbones. Her eyes were like a cat's pupils, but the eye color was brown. She had dark-colored lips, not quite black, but really close the moment I popped up with my light. She, or it, bared its teeth and hissed, quickly pulling itself out of the tiny tent. I'll never forget those teeth. They weren't humanoid teeth. Instead, they were long and sharp like a dog's. I did try to go after it, but by the time I shifted around and got out of my bag and exited the tent, she was gone, as were the contents of the snacks I'd hidden in my bag from that point on. I slept with the rest of the kids in the big tents, and we used my pup tent to hold extra gear like people's backpacks. I know it's not a very exciting story. The whole experience lasted less than 2 minutes since then. I've always been wary of nature. I don't really talk about it because who'd believe a story like this, even though it does sort of haunt me to this day. My step-grandparents owned a lot of property in the mountains of Morgan County, Utah. My siblings and I spent a lot of time exploring the woods there, which were right behind my grandparents' house. Skip forward 20 years. My grandparents have long since passed away, but I still spend a lot of time in these mountains camping. Since it's private property, we don't see many people while camping there. I've experienced many strange things while out there, but this is one of the strangest. 2 of my friends and I were staying overnight in a trailer we had on the property. We were just talking and hanging out. All of a sudden, we heard a very loud, vibrating wind sound, and the trailer began to shake and sort of vibrate. It lasted about 30 to 45 seconds, then abruptly stopped. We all looked at each other, and I could tell they were just as confused as I was. We opened the door, and it was as calm as it had been right before it happened. There was no storm, no wind, no rain, nothing. I have no idea what it could have been. On another occasion, 2 different friends and I were hiking up to a cabin that I had found in the woods on an earlier trip. You have to climb over a gate to get to the cabin, which was still about 300 feet through thick trees. I climbed over the gate first and started walking through the tall grass that was just before the trees. Then, on the path about 20 feet in front of me, I saw a very, very large dog. The dog was all white, with long hair and very dark eyes. He was just sitting there, staring at me. He didn't move or make a sound. I slowly started backing up and told my friend to back up also. My other friend was just getting over the fence and asked what we were doing. I told her we were trying to get away from the big dog without upsetting it. Both my friends looked confused but backed up anyway, and we all went back over the fence. After that, they told me they didn't see any dog anywhere. I thought that was impossible because that dog I saw was huge and sitting right in the middle of the path. Another time, the same friends and I were gathering wood for a fire. We were on a hillside on the opposite side of the road from camp. When we looked in the direction of camp, we could see a door, a perfect door with a window and doorknob, just kind of floating at the base of some trees. All 3 of us saw this, but we didn't have cell phones, so we couldn't get a picture. These are just a few of the weird things that happened on this mountain. It's a very strange place. This happened during the summer I graduated high school a few years back. Since the end of that summer, I've moved for college. My high school was in a suburban setting, but the campus was surrounded by a good amount of forest. I joined the cross country team in 9th grade, and that kind of developed my love for hiking and exploring. Often, we'd run on the trails that were dispersed through the forest, especially behind the high school. Some of these trails stretched for many miles. I recall one day our coach was unable to make practice after school due to being sick. Our team captain told us we could basically free roam the forest that day and explore in our own groups if we desired. This was the day I knew I would always have a desire to explore the unknown. My friends and I were jogging around on unused trails and came across an old shack containing various old tools and weapons. Nothing was unordinary besides the fact that there were a bunch of things like axes and daggers hidden inside the place, all of which were mostly in old and brittle condition. The area was abandoned and in the middle of the forest. No one seemed to have come here in a while. We didn't think much of it and labeled it as a good find. Later on that day, after cross-country practice, me and 2 of my friends came back to the high school to explore some more. This time, we went in the complete opposite direction of where the shack was and ended up finding an abandoned trailer. This time, the trailer was the kind you would see on the back of semis. It was at that point of dilapidation and really had nothing left to offer, yet there was no truck in sight. That made us wonder how it got into the woods in the first place without a clear path long enough to even transport to this location. Next to the back of the truck, a single-story, makeshift-looking house that was clearly the victim of a fire sat. The place was practically crumbling and nothing inside was worth taking a look at. However, the trailer had some interesting stuff inside. Although it was peculiar finding this stuff deep in the woods, a lot of it was either junk that appeared to be old, or antiques that ranged from typewriters to dressers that appeared to be made back in the 1900s. We labeled this as our biggest find yet, and were really excited. That wrapped up the day, though a lot of other cool and odd things had happened in our expeditions to the forest since then, but nothing as bizarre and freakish as what I'm about to tell you. The purpose of stating all of this was to explain how my love for hiking and exploring came into play. Since then, my friends and I continued to go to this forest behind the high school from time to time to explore and hang out. Now, as officially graduated seniors, my friends and I decided to have one last time in those woods before we split off in our own unique directions in life. While it was a day filled with deep nostalgia and sadness reminiscing the good old days, we also got the fright of our life. This time, we dedicated the whole day to the woods. We got ready in the morning and rode our mountain bikes into the forest, bringing camping supplies and such. That day was different, as we decided we were going to camp overnight in the woods. After all, we had never done that before, and as our last time coming here together, we figured we better make it memorable. There were 4 of us in total. We told our parents we were going to stay the night at one of our friends' houses. Looking back, I kinda wish that's what we ended up doing. Anyway, we got there in the morning and found an area to set up camp. It was at the bottom of a really steep elevation, and there was a clearing at the bottom with an already made fire pit. Apparently, someone had already been there in the past. There were beer cans and ammunition shells scattered everywhere. I've come to learn that this area of the forest was actually used as a shooting range back in the day. We started on our hike and pretty much screwed around all day on the trails. We graffitied a bridge about a mile down the trail from our campsite, writing stuff like, "So-and-so was here and such." We figured we had to document our last day and all the other days we had spent in this awesome forest before we all left, for college. When you entered the forest, there was a main path that went straight, with many side paths. The area where we camped was about a quarter mile into the trail from the high school to the left. If you kept going straight on the main path, you would eventually get to the bridge where we had our little art exhibit. To the left was where the shack was, and to the right was where the trailer was, each on their own paths a few miles in. And if you went straight past the old broken bridge, you'd go further into the woods where many more trails could be found that we hadn't completely been on. The day went well with absolutely nothing wrong. Thankfully, we hadn't run into anyone else because a lot of the stuff we ended up doing was definitely not allowed on private property. Soon, it was getting dark, and we began to get ready for our campfire. Beers in hand and memories on our minds, we started our nostalgia trip. Things had been going great. At one point, the fire had begun to die down, and we decided to let it go. After all, the embers would stay alive for a while, and that was all we really needed at this point. By then, it was around 1 in the morning, and we had all fallen asleep. I suddenly woke up, not knowing what time it was. Everyone else appeared to be asleep, though I didn't move much because shortly after I woke up, I heard something. It sounded like footsteps crunching on beer cans and earth. I truthfully couldn't tell if it was on 2 feet or 4 yet, but I just assumed it was an animal walking around the campsite in search of food or something. That's when I realized we were complete idiots for not cleaning up after ourselves and putting our stuff away before dozing off. But I was far from guessing right. At least, I think I was. I hadn't made a single motion since I'd awakened. Even worse, whatever was near us was not facing in my direction the way I was. I was completely vulnerable to whatever this thing was. That's when I suddenly heard a new set of footsteps approaching the campsite. There was dead silence besides these footsteps rummaging around our campsite. That's when I made out. Whatever these things were had to be bipedal. The crickets and frogs in the area ceased to make noise. A few moments later, everything was dead silent, including the noise of whoever was in our camping area. The sounds of the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they came. I lifted my body up to look frantically around the campsite and woke up my friends. I noticed that the embers had been put out by water, which none of us had done, and smoke was gently wafting into the air. We were almost in complete darkness. I reached for my phone and saw that it was 2 in the morning. It was as if whatever these things were knew the moment we had all fallen asleep. The fire being put out must have happened right before I woke up. My friends were all awake then, wondering why I'd woken them up. All I could say was, I heard footsteps by our campsite, but they were audibly gone now. Suddenly, out of nowhere, an ear-piercing scream shot out into the air from the path taken to get to our camping spot at higher elevation. As I looked in that general direction, I could see at the top of the trail something looking down at us. Another scream rang out. It almost sounded like an Aztec death whistle if I were to compare it to something. It was much lower in tone, with an almost insect-like clicking noise to it. I nearly soiled myself. That's how taken aback I was. We were in utter shock, unable to move. That's when it hit me. Where was the other thing? It had accompanied that figure at the camp. Was it near us? I only saw one at the top of the trail. I never found out, though. Whatever was at the top of the trail had now begun to skulk off further deep into the woods toward the bridge. All I could make out was its tall, slender silhouette. Where its eyes were supposed to be were 2 small, eerily green, reflecting slits. I was scared beyond my wits. I told everyone we were going to make a run for it. After all, we weren't too far from the high school, about a quarter-mile away, give or take. We ditched everything and ran. We decided we'd come back for anything we left the next day with a bigger group of people. We ran straight out of the woods, not hearing anything else besides our own footsteps. We all snuck into my friend's basement after that through an emergency hatch and stayed there for the rest of the night, making sure to log and secure any form of entry out of paranoia, due to what we had just witnessed. Never in my life have I experienced something so terrifying. Never in my life had I seen or heard anything remotely similar to the sound of whatever it was we heard that night. We went back 2 days later and found everything there intact. However, 2 of the 4 bikes had been thrown around and scratched up. Our sleeping bags had been shredded and slung upon tree branches way up high. Everything was just a disturbing mess. The forest had resumed with its sound of nature, signifying that anything dangerous was most likely far off. Whatever was out there that night had come back in an attempt to find us again, but only found the remains of what we left behind. What I'll never know is why those things were near our camp or in the forest, and what their ultimate goal was. In coming near us, I mean, maybe it could have been some sort of group messing with people, but the idea of that seems really far off. It wouldn't fully explain all the incidents that happened that night. I also learned that there was an ancient cemetery somewhere along the path if you went straight past the bridge a few miles on a discrete side path. My cross-country captain apparently found it with a few others when I mentioned the whole incident on a group chat. Maybe they were ghosts. Maybe they were Wendigos. I really have no idea. Regardless, I still have trouble thinking about it to this day. But I know deep down that whatever happened that night, whatever those creatures were, they had bad intentions, and were likely pure evil. I'm a Boy Scout, and the pinnacle of scouting is considered to be Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. Philmont is land-owned in New Mexico, where crews of scouts plan a backpacking trip to different locations over the course of many days. I'm not good at backpacking, so on this trip, I expected hardship and pain, but not fear. But Boy Scouts is about expecting the unexpected, and this experience scared me so badly that I needed somewhere to talk about it and share it with others. In fact, we're riding back now to go home. I just need to get this off my chest. Things began happening around the middle of the trek. Me and a friend of mine were in our tent talking after a long day of hiking. Philmont has quite a few ties to Native Americans, so we were talking about that, which brought us to the topic of skinwalkers. My friend immediately told me to shut up and change the topic. He told me that names have power. I was kind of annoyed. I wanted to talk about that, and yet I immediately got shut down. Who cares about names anyway, I thought. This is stupid Harry Potter type stuff. Shortly after, we went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming, but it wasn't human screaming. It sounded like a deer, but all sorts of wrong. Deer are common in Philmont, and I had heard them make sounds before, but this sounded distorted and wrong. The screaming continued for at least 2 more hours before finally stopping. By then, I was on edge, but my exhaustion got the best of me, and I eventually fell asleep. The next day, we got up early and thankfully arrived early at the next campsite. As night fell, I put last night's events behind me and went to sleep as usual. That night, I slept well. We woke up extra early the next morning, around 3 a.m. It was going to be a long hike, and our guys wanted to get a bit of a head start. I was late getting out of my tent and packing my bags, so there was a small point in time where I was left alone in the dark, packing my stuff. Suddenly, the screaming began again. Just barely in my view, I saw a boy with a headlamp walk into the forest. I started yelling and screaming for him to turn around and go back to camp, but I was too far away, and soon his light disappeared into the forest. I don't know if these events are related, but it left me very on edge. Things were fine, for a while. I'd hear the screaming every now and then, but nothing would come of it. Finally, we arrived back at base camp. When we finished our trek, me and the guys settled in and prepared for our last night. I heard one of our crew members calling my name from his tent. He asked if I could shine a light outside because he thought he saw something through the flaps. Annoyed, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it outside. It all happened so fast, but just as I pointed my flashlight outside, I saw a pale, white and bony leg disappear behind a row of tents. It looked like the leg of a horse, but with an elongated human foot at its end. I was in shock. I told my friend I hadn't seen anything and just lay in my bed, clutching my knife. The screaming began again, and that just made the situation much worse. I got little to no sleep. I was very eager to get out of there. All that matters is that I'm gone now, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. If you could take one thing away from this story, it's that you should never taunt something that you don't understand, something that you don't want to come after you. Because I got lucky. It just decided to give me a little scare, that's all. Please take it from me, though. Don't mess with legends, because they might decide to mess with you. Romania is a country where people might get kidnapped, murdered, or just disappear. My parents were afraid for me and completely against my plan. I had to lie and say we'd be staying in a hotel near Kozia National Park, when really we were going camping. We took a train from Bucharest to the park, about a 2-hour ride. We had everything we needed: backpacks, supplies, high spirits. The train was packed, except our compartment. That was rare. I was thrilled to think we'd have the whole space to ourselves, but that didn't last long. A man entered our compartment, followed by a beautiful German shepherd. Now, I love animals. Cats, dogs, you name it. Usually, I can win over even the grumpiest pets, but not this one. The dog was strange, unnaturally stiff, like a stuffed toy. It obeyed its owner's every command without hesitation. Impressive, yes, but unnerving. I tried making small talk. The man barely responded. The only thing I got from him was the dog's name, Usigașul. It means the killer in Romanian. Odd choice. Even more odd was that he didn't say it like it was a joke. When I asked why the name, he said bluntly, "This dog is trained to kill. It's the only thing he likes and is good at." That set me on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe he was a hunter, but where would it even be legal to hunt in these forests? Then, unprompted, the man asked, "Are you going to Kozia National Park?" That was weird. We only mentioned it at the train station, nowhere near this guy. I answered honestly. He gave us a list of recommendations: monasteries, waterfalls, caves, and a local restaurant. When he talked about nature, his eyes lit up, but he gripped the dog's collar tightly, hard enough to make it clink. The dog didn't even flinch. Eventually, We arrived. He waved goodbye and we walked away. I turned back a moment later to ask about the restaurant, but he and the dog were gone, completely vanished. No trace, no luggage. That should have been my first warning. We headed out, backpacks on, 10 kilos each. We passed through a tunnel into the mountain. It was short, we could see the end, but halfway through, we heard a distant dog crying. I wanted to investigate. My boyfriend gave me the "please don't" look, but I didn't listen. We found a chubby white and brown puppy crying in the road, hurt, limping. We called to him and he perked up and ran straight to us, alone and terrified. We named him Rudolph. 1 kilometer later, we found his sister. Someone had thrown her into a river. We pulled her out, soaked, freezing, and shaking. Now we had 2 puppies. We reached the monastery that the man had mentioned, but couldn't go inside with dogs. So we walked the gardens and kept going until we reached the base of the mountain, Itikenti. Puppies, adorable little brats, refused to walk. If we set them down, they cried and sat like stones. We kept moving, finding a small clearing near a religious shrine. It was more like a 4-walled shelter with no door, just a roof, and inside, a Bible and an icon. I flipped through the Bible out of curiosity. Most pages had scribbled names, like people carving initials into trees. But on one page, written in red ink, were the words, "I will find you." I laughed it off. Probably someone trying to scare travelers. We set up the tent, made a fire, ate, fed the puppies, and settled in. It got dark. At midnight, the puppies stirred. I let them out to pee. They came back, cried a bit more. Then we heard grunting behind the tent. My boyfriend stepped out, just as the fire began to die, and whatever it was ran off into the woods with a slithering sound, like something dragging itself at high speed through the leaves. He said he saw something, a slithering shape, with feet. We stayed up, relit the fire. At 3 a.m., the puppies whined again. The fire was dying again. We went out for more firewood. That's when I heard whispers between the trees. Birds were chirping loudly and flapping their wings. But birds don't normally do that at 3 a.m., do they? Then, something even stranger. The fire's sparks weren't dying. They floated, red, then green, toward the woods, one after the other, as if forming a trail. I got goosebumps. I scanned the trees. Dozens, maybe hundreds of eye-shaped knots stared back at us. I knew they weren't real eyes, but still, it felt like they were watching. Then, movement. A rustle in the bush 10 meters away. A dark, hunched figure emerged, half in, half out of the bush. It shook like a dog. I heard the clink of a collar. My boyfriend got the fire roaring and the creature fled. It had feet, but moved like a snake. We calmed down. A little. Back in the tent, we tried to sleep. I kept the zipper cracked open, just enough to watch that. Bush. After a while, movement. I shook my boyfriend awake, and we watched together as a head slowly rose from the bush. Then shoulders, a torso, a leg, until a naked man emerged, walking toward our fire. It was the man from the train. He didn't see us watching. He walked to our fire and began tearing it apart, removing wood, kicking rocks, dismantling it. Then, he backed into the bush again, slowly, his face the last thing to vanish, mouth gaping, moaning like a ghost. We sat by the campfire with torches, wide awake, until sunrise. Once it was light, we packed up and got the hell out of there. What was meant to be a 4-day trip ended after one night. To this day, I don't know if that man followed us, or if it was just a horrible coincidence. But here's my advice. Never tell strangers your location. Always stay alert. Always listen to your instincts, because next time you might not be so lucky.